Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to completely unpack the massive and honestly fascinating world of language pedagogy and the diverse classroom. Whether you're an aspiring teacher just stepping into your very first classroom, a veteran educator looking to kind of refresh your approach, or honestly just a curious learner wondering how human beings actually acquire and process language, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to break down exactly how the brain learns a language, and more importantly, how we can practically apply that knowledge in a room full of incredibly unique students.
It's kind of the ultimate educator's dilemma, isn't it? Picture walking into a bustling classroom. Every single student sitting there is entirely unique. They're bringing their own cultural background, their own hidden abilities, and their own very specific challenges to the table. But how do we teach them all at once? How do educators possibly bridge the gap between complex, abstract language acquisition theories and the daily, often messy reality of a highly diverse classroom? Well, that is exactly the puzzle we're going to solve today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our theory to practice roadmap. We'll start with the theories of language acquisition, move right into the evolution of teaching methods, then tackle navigating the diverse classroom, addressing specific learning disabilities, and finally, wrap up with strategies for remedial teaching.
Section 1. Theories of Language Acquisition.
Our first major concept is Stephen Krashen's acquisition learning hypothesis. Basically, Krashen argues that there are two entirely separate, distinct processes at work in our brains. First, there's acquisition. This is subconscious. It's exactly how a toddler effortlessly picks up their mother tongue. It doesn't involve any formal instruction, and it creates genuine, durable fluency where words just flow naturally. Learning, on the other hand, is conscious instruction. It's what happens when you furiously memorize grammar rules for a high school Spanish test. You're actively trying to construct the language. According to Krashen, learning mostly just acts as a mental monitor. You know, it's that little voice that makes you hesitate right before you speak because you're internally editing your own grammar, rather than producing true spontaneous fluency. Then we have the behaviorist theory, famously championed by the psychologist B.F. Skinner. Skinner believed that children enter the world as a total blank slate. From this perspective, language isn't innate at all. It's entirely a product of the environment, built through a really strict, repetitive cycle of stimulus, response, and positive reinforcement. Basically, think of it like this. A child hears a word, attempts to imitate it, and gets approval, like a parent clapping and smiling. That positive response fixes the language as a permanent habit. And if the environment doesn't reward the speech, well, the habit simply doesn't form.
But Noam Chomsky sharply contrasted Skinner's behaviorism with his nativist theory. Chomsky argued that humans are actually biologically pre-programmed for language. He pointed out the astonishing cross-linguistic uniformity of child development, meaning children all over the world, regardless of their native language or their culture, acquire basic sentence grammar at roughly the exact same age. To Chomsky, this is absolute proof that we're hardwired with what he famously called a language acquisition device, or LAD. This device contains a universal grammar, basically a sort of biological template shared by all human languages right from birth.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how perfectly a simple childhood mistake proves the point. Consider the highly specific phrase, "I good," to the market. According to our sources, when a child says "I good" instead of "I went," it perfectly illustrates Chomsky's theory in action. Think about it for a second. The child has literally never heard an adult say "I good." Therefore, they aren't just imitating their environment and repeating what they heard, like Skinner suggested. Instead, they are actively making a creative, rule-governed overgeneralization. They subconsciously learned the rule to add ed for past tense and confidently applied it all by themselves to an irregular verb. They're basically little grammar scientists testing their own internal rules. Finally, we have the social interactionist theory, led by Lev Vygotsky and Jerome Bruner. They essentially bridge the gap between these opposing views. They argue that yes, we absolutely have innate biological abilities, but those abilities require meaningful social interaction to actually unlock. Think of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, the ZPD, as the gap between what a child can do entirely alone and what they can achieve with a little bit of help. Bruner added that adults provide crucial scaffolding across this gap. A perfect example is the simplified, highly melodic motherese speech you naturally use with a baby. This scaffolding allows the child to actively participate in communication long before they have the vocabulary to manage it all on their own.
Section 2. Evolution of Teaching Methods.
So how did these psychological theories historically shape what teachers actually do in the classroom? Well, looking at the historical timeline, there's been a massive, fundamental shift. In the 19th century, we relied heavily on the grammar translation method, where rules were explained entirely in the mother tongue, and the focus was almost exclusively on translating classic literature. I mean, it produced students who could perfectly conjugate verbs on paper, but couldn't order a cup of coffee. Then, in the mid-20th century, deeply influenced by Skinner's behaviorism, the audiolingual method took over. Classrooms became these places of rote drilling, memorization, and immediate error correction. Today, however, we've evolved to communicative language teaching, or CLT. CLT focuses on functional use and true communicative competence. It's not just about knowing the rules anymore. It's about knowing how to negotiate, argue, apologize, and explain in real-world, unpredictable scenarios. And modern educational policies deeply reflect this communicative approach. When you look at guidelines like India's NCF 2005 and the NEP 2020, there is a strong push for mother tongue-based instruction in the foundational primary years. Furthermore, they officially view the multilingual classroom and the natural fluid code switching that comes with it as a massive national asset, not some kind of deficiency that needs to be fixed. Crucially, these frameworks explicitly state that student errors are essential. A mistake is not a sign of ignorance. It is vital, expected evidence of a student actively testing their own hypotheses about how a new language works.
Section 3. Navigating the diverse classroom.
And this brilliantly illustrates Eddy's 1999 framework for learning styles. Students organize and assimilate information quite differently depending on their internal wiring. Auditory learners thrive on spoken words, lectures, and rich classroom discussions. Visual learners absolutely need graphs, pictures, and color-coded outlines to connect complex concepts. Kinesthetic learners? They need movement and tactile hands-on exploration. Often these are the kids unfairly labeled as hyperactive or disruptive, when in reality they just need to physically interact with their environment to learn. And finally, read/write learners absorb information best by making detailed lists, taking copious notes, and summarizing texts. So a successful teacher really cannot rely on just one delivery method. They have to continuously diversify their lessons to hit all four styles.
But underlying all these varied learning styles is the absolute fundamental role of listening. Active listening isn't just a passive intake of data while you're waiting for your turn to speak. It is a vital, dynamic function of language itself. It's the bridge that enables true learning, facilitates meaningful interpersonal interactions, and most importantly, fosters deep empathy across incredibly diverse student backgrounds. Honestly, cultivating a classroom of active listeners is the very first step to building a truly inclusive environment.
Section 4. Addressing specific learning disabilities.
Beyond learning styles, diverse classrooms include students facing specific neurological barriers, and recognizing these early literally changes lives. Dyslexia involves profound difficulty reading, decoding, or recognizing words. Dysgraphia is a physical and cognitive struggle with writing and organizing thoughts coherently on paper. Then there's dyscalculia, which affects the brain's ability to understand numbers, math operations, and spatial reasoning. Aphasia is a neurological communication disorder affecting language production and comprehension. An auditory processing disorder means the brain struggles to interpret heard sounds correctly, especially in noisy environments, like, say, a busy classroom. The critical takeaway here for educators is that these students almost always have average or well above average intelligence. They are smart. They just process specific information differently and need targeted, personalized support to really shine.
Now, in addition to neurological processing differences, we also have to adapt for physical impairments and functional needs. Visual impairments might require braille, large print materials, or magnifying tools. Hearing impairments demand visual aids, sign language support, and clear face-to-face instruction. Attention disorders like ADD and ADHD absolutely require concrete classroom adaptations. Think frequent movement breaks, flexible seating arrangements, and delivering instructions in short, manageable chunks. And mobility challenges require essential physical accommodations, things like ramps, accessible desks, and wider navigation spaces so every single student can move with independence and dignity.
Section 5. Strategies for remedial teaching.
So the crucial point is, how do we systematically help the students who are falling behind? The cornerstone of this process is the Individualized Educational Program, or IEP. An IEP is exactly how modern schools lock in remedial teaching to ensure no one falls through the cracks. First, you set highly specific short-term and long-term teaching objectives for the individual pupil, based entirely on their current baseline. Next, you design customized learning steps and activities tailored directly to their abilities and interests. And third, you conduct continuous reviews. This isn't just a set-it-and-forget-it document that sits in a drawer. It's a dynamic loop where you evaluate the effectiveness of the program and gather direct, honest feedback from the pupil to ensure the approach is actually working.
Beyond the formal IEP, teachers can utilize several other really dynamic strategies. Curriculum adaptation is massive here. Teachers shouldn't feel rigidly dictated by a textbook. They should boldly streamline learning into core versus non-core aspects, so struggling students don't get completely overwhelmed by unnecessary fluff. Then there are peer support programs. By training stronger students to act as little teachers, you simultaneously reinforce the mentor's knowledge while giving the struggling student a highly relatable, way less intimidating source of support. And never underestimate reward schemes. Setting clear, achievable micro-targets and providing instant, diversified rewards can drastically turn around a student's motivation.
Now, this is important. Often, what looks like a behavioral problem is actually a manifestation of a severe learning difficulty. The sources note that acting out frequently stems from a profound lack of self-confidence or a really poor self-image due to sheer academic frustration. The strategy here demands immense patience and empathy. You must establish mutual trust and listen carefully to the student. Use positive reinforcement intensely for any good behavior, and intentionally try not to pay undue attention to minor misbehavior. Most importantly, do not try to change all of a student's deviant behavior at once. Address it patiently, step by step, validating their worth every single step of the way.
Which brings us to a final critical reflection. As an educator, your own personal learning style and your own deeply ingrained cultural assumptions directly influence your teaching methods, and sometimes they create your blind spots. So, are you ready to challenge your own biases and take these powerful pedagogical tools into your future classrooms? Understanding the deep psychological theories of language and applying them with genuine empathy is what transforms a standard, run-of-the-mill classroom into a truly thriving, inclusive environment where every student genuinely has a voice. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and keep learning.